The sky wasn't falling. It was already dead. For 3 weeks, we breathed pulverized concrete and the metallic tang of our own dried blood, waiting for an evacuation that was never coming. The distress beacon had gone silent on day 4. We were 50,000 stranded colonists trading our final breaths for inches of dirt against a relentless alien siege. We expected silence. We expected the cold end of a bayonet. What we didn't expect was the atmosphere catching fire as the void screamed back. Caleb stared at the vibration in his water tin. It was a rhythmic, agonizing ripple. Thump, thump, thump. Every impact from the orbital bombardments above sent a shockwave down through 40 meters of bedrock, rattling the loose filings in his back molars. He didn't feel brave. He just felt aggressively tired. The bunker smelled like a locker room that had caught fire. A stagnant mix of stale sweat, voided bowels in the far corner, and the sharp chemical reek of ozone leaking from the failing atmospheric scrubbers. They had been in the dark for 3 days since the primary generators took a direct hit from a plasma lance. Now the only light came from the sickly amber glow of emergency strips running along the ceiling, casting long, hollowed-out shadows across the faces of the survivors. Beside him, Davis was picking at a scab on his knuckle. He'd been doing it for an hour. The quiet snick-snick of his dirty fingernail catching the edge of dried blood was the loudest thing in the room between the artillery strikes. "Stop it," Caleb said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. Davis didn't look up. He just kept picking. "Gotta keep it clean. Infection. It's not gonna get infected if you stop ripping it open." "Doesn't matter anyway," a voice rasped from the dark corner. It was Miller, the medic. Or at least the guy who had been holding the med kit when the actual medic caught a shrapnel burst on the ridge. Miller's uniform was stiff with rust-colored stains that he had given up trying to wash out. "They're going to breach the upper levels by nightfall. The seismic sensors are reading heavy mechanized movement above Sector 4. They aren't just bombing us anymore. They're landing the crawlers." Caleb leaned his head back against the cold, damp rock of the bunker wall. It was slimy, condensation mixed with the dust. He closed his eyes, feeling the grit grind between his eyelids. The invaders, a multi-legged, heavily armored species the colonists had uncreatively dubbed the Hounds, didn't communicate. They didn't issue demands. They just arrived in the system 2 months ago and began systematically dismantling the orbital defense grid like a butcher breaking down a carcass. Then they landed. The planetary distress beacon, a massive spire in the capital, had pumped out a continuous repeating SOS to the core worlds. Earth, the mighty United Terran Fleet. But Earth was a 6-month slipspace jump away, assuming the relays were even functioning. Assuming Earth even cared about a backwater trillium mining rock on the ragged edge of the Perseus arm. "Any word from the comms?" Caleb asked, not really wanting to know the answer. "Dead," Miller said flatly. "Been dead since Tuesday. The antenna array is slag. Even if command was trying to reach us, we wouldn't hear it. We're blind and deaf." Caleb reached down and unclipped the magazine from his kinetic rifle. He weighed it in his hand. Heavy. He pressed his thumb against the top round, brass casing, cold. He had 12 rounds left, 12 bullets to stop an invasion force that swarmed like locusts. He didn't feel a heroic resolve welling up inside him. He felt a sickening hollow drop in his stomach. He was 32 years old. He had come to this rock to fix atmospheric processors, not die in a hole clutching a gun he barely knew how to clean. The shaking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the bombing. It was thick, heavy, and pregnant with malice. The bombardment had ceased. That meant the hounds were close enough that orbital strikes would hit their own troops. "Helmets on!" Caleb said softly. Nobody argued. The sound of latches clicking into place echoed down the tunnel. It was the sound of a tomb sealing shut. Caleb checked his HUD. The battery was flashing a dull, angry red. 14%. Just enough juice to project the targeting reticle and keep his comms open for the next hour. After that, he'd be shooting blind. He hauled himself up from the dirt floor, his joints popping. His knees ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that made him want to sit right back down. He ignored it, slinging the rifle strap over his shoulder and moving toward the heavy blast door that separated their tunnel from the primary access shaft. "Check your seals," he muttered over the local frequency. "If they flood the shaft with toxic gas again, I don't want to listen to you choke." Davis stood up, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't get the clasp of his rebreather to align. Caleb watched him struggle for a moment. He didn't feel pity. He felt annoyed. A raw, jagged spike of irritation that Davis couldn't even manage this simple task. Caleb stepped forward, slapping Davis's hands away roughly, and snapped the clasp into place himself. "Breathe," Caleb ordered. "I can't." Davis wheezed, his eyes wide and terrified behind the scratched visor of his helmet. "Caleb, I'm going to be sick. I'm going to throw up in the helmet." "Swallow it," Caleb snapped, stepping back. It was cruel, but he didn't care. Empathy had burned out a week ago, somewhere around the time they had to pile the bodies of the engineering team into a side tunnel and seal it to keep the smell away. "You throw up, you clog the filters, you suffocate. Swallow it down and hold your damn gun." He turned to the blast door. It was a massive slab of reinforced titanium, dented inward in 3 places where the hounds had tried to breach it yesterday with kinetic rams. The metal was groaning under some unseen pressure. Scratch. Squeal. The sound came from the other side. It wasn't a heavy booming knock. It was the delicate, terrifying sound of hardened chitin scraping against metal. They were testing the door, looking for a seam. Miller stepped up beside Caleb, raising his weapon. His breathing was loud over the comm's ragged, uneven pulls of recycled air. "How many do you think are out there? Does it matter?" Caleb asked. He raised his own rifle, seating the stock firmly against his bruised shoulder. The recoil was going to be agony. He was already bracing for it. "I just wanted to know if we have enough bullets." "We don't." A sudden sharp hiss sounded from the edge of the door frame. Smoke, thick yellow and smelling of sulfur and rotting eggs, began to jet through a microfracture in the seal. The hounds were using their acid spitters to eat through the locking mechanism. Caleb watched the metal begin to blister and bubble. It was mesmerizing in a morbid way. The titanium literally wept, turning into a glowing viscous slurry that dripped onto the floor with loud sizzling pops. "Back up," Caleb said, taking a slow step in reverse. "Give them room to push through. We funnel them. We don't let them fan out." He didn't know if that was standard military doctrine. He just knew he wanted the monsters to stay in a straight line so he didn't have to aim as much. The door gave way with a sickening shriek of tearing metal. It didn't fall inward. It was ripped outward, pulled into the shaft by something impossibly strong. The sudden change in pressure sucked the stale air out of the bunker, pulling a cloud of dust and loose debris toward the opening. In the gloom of the shaft, hundreds of red luminescent eyes ignited. They looked like dying embers in a fire pit. The clicking started. A wave of auditory terror, thousands of mandibles snapping together in rapid succession, echoing off the concrete walls. It sounded like a rainstorm made of bones. "Fire!" Caleb screamed, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for the others. He pulled the trigger. The kinetic rifle bucked hard, slamming into his shoulder and rattling his teeth. The flash of the muzzle illuminated the darkness for a fraction of a second, revealing a nightmare of jagged limbs, armored carapaces, and gaping, drooling maws. The first hound caught a 3-round burst in its center of mass. The armor held for the first 2 rounds, but the third shattered the chitin, plunging into the soft, gelatinous meat beneath. The creature shrieked a high-piercing mechanical whine and crumpled only to be instantly trampled by the sheer mass of bodies surging forward behind it. Davis opened up, firing wildly, his tracer rounds, ricocheting off the ceiling and walls, illuminating the slaughter in chaotic bursts of red light. Miller was more disciplined, firing single shots, but the tide was too much. They were going to die here, in the dark, covered in dust, screaming. Caleb felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The waiting was finally over. But then the ground stopped shaking from the horde. It started vibrating from something else. It started as a low hum. Not a vibration in the rock, but a pressure in the air. It felt like the moment before a massive thunderstorm breaks, when the barometric pressure drops so fast it makes your ears pop. The hounds paused. It was the most unnatural thing Caleb had ever seen. The relentless, mindless swarm suddenly halted. Hundreds of armored heads snapped upward simultaneously, their red eyes darting toward the ceiling of the access shaft, staring through the bedrock toward the surface. "What are they doing?" Davis yelled over the deafening silence, his rifle still raised, finger trembling on the trigger. "I don't know," Caleb breathed. Then the sky tore open. Even buried 40 meters underground, the sound was catastrophic. It wasn't an explosion. It was a roar. A deep, guttural, sustained bellow that sounded like a god dragging a continent across a seabed. The sheer acoustic force of it slammed down the access shaft, hitting the survivors like a physical blow. Caleb was thrown onto his back, his helmet cracking violently against the stone floor. The emergency lights didn't just flicker, they shattered. The glass bulbs exploded from the sudden pressure wave, plunging the bunker into absolute darkness, save for the red eyes of the invaders. His HUD glitched static, washing across his vision. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard something he hadn't heard in 2 months. The comm system, dead and buried, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static so loud it made his teeth ache. "Is Terran Dreadnought Gravewalker to all colonial forces. Keep your heads down. We're doing a little landscaping." The voice was human. It was calm. It was laced with a thick, cynical drawl that sounded so utterly out of place in the apocalypse that Caleb thought he was hallucinating from a concussion. Above them, the surface of the planet ceased to exist as they knew it. The hounds in the tunnel suddenly broke their paralysis, but they didn't charge the colonists. They turned and tried to scramble back up the shaft, a chaotic mass of panic. They were too late. The vibration escalated into a series of massive rolling earthquakes. The Terran ships hadn't just arrived in orbit. They had bypassed the standard deceleration protocols entirely. They dropped out of slipspace directly into the upper atmosphere, using their massive gravitational engines to violently displace the air. Caleb scrambled to his feet, grabbing the edge of a console to stay upright. The monitors on the wall, dead for weeks, suddenly flickered on, hijacked by a colossal broadcast signal originating from the ships above. The screen fed them a live orbital view, heavily distorted by atmospheric interference. It wasn't a sleek, elegant fleet of rescue ships. It was an armada of brutalist flying anvils. The human warships were blocky, scarred, and ugly. They looked like they had been built in a scrapyard by a species that viewed aesthetics as a personal insult. Massive, sprawling dreadnoughts painted in drab grays and blacks, their hulls marred by scorch marks and old battle damage. They were dropping straight through the atmosphere engines, burning with a violent radioactive blue light. They didn't slow down. They plummeted toward the surface like meteors' massive atmospheric displacement waves, tearing the clouds apart in a rippling circle around them. "Look at the telemetry," Miller whispered, staring at the secondary monitor. Caleb looked. The human ships weren't targeting the orbital grids. They were ignoring the Hound cruisers entirely. The dreadnoughts were plunging directly into the heart of the Hound ground forces. The lead ship, a monstrosity of jagged metal and protruding weapon batteries, leveled out barely 2,000 meters above the capital city. The shockwave of its deceleration hit the ground, flattening every structure in a 10-mile radius that the Hounds had built. Then the ship opened fire. It didn't use energy weapons. There were no bright, clean lasers or elegant plasma lances. The humans used kinetics, brutal, primitive, overwhelmingly massive kinetics. The underbelly of the dreadnought lit up in a continuous rolling barrage of fire. Macro cannons firing tungsten slugs the size of city buses rained down on the Hound landing zones. The impacts didn't just kill the invaders, they atomized them, leaving craters 100 meters wide. The ground beneath Caleb's feet violently heaved, tossing him back down into the mud. Dirt rained from the ceiling. A chunk of rock the size of a tire crashed down where Davis had been standing a moment before. "Colony Command, this is Gravewalker," the voice on the comms drawled again, cutting through the static. "We read hostile armor concentrating above your coordinates, dropping the hammer." "Wait, no!" Caleb screamed into his dead mic, panic seizing his chest. "We're right underneath them." He didn't even have time to brace. A deafening crack ripped through the bedrock. The ceiling of the access shaft 20 meters away simply ceased to exist. A blinding shaft of daylight punched through the subterranean gloom, followed instantly by a massive smoking tungsten rod that slammed into the floor of the shaft. The impact vaporized the horde of Hounds that had been trying to flee. The shockwave threw Caleb, Miller, and Davis backward into the far wall of the bunker. The air was sucked out of Caleb's lungs, his vision going white, then black, as the sheer kinetic force rattled his brain against his skull. When his vision slowly began to return, clearing through the thick, choking cloud of pulverized rock and alien viscera, he looked toward the entrance. The blast door was gone. The shaft was gone. In their place was a massive sloping crater that led directly up to the surface. Sunlight, harsh, unfiltered, and blindingly bright, poured down into the hole. The air smelled different. The ozone and blood were gone, replaced by the overpowering scent of burning metal, scorched earth, and the distinct acrid tang of high-yield explosives. Caleb pulled himself to his feet, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. He limped toward the edge of the crater, his boots slipping on the glassy, fused rock where the tungsten rod had hit. He looked up. The sky wasn't dead anymore. It was alive with fire. Hundreds of human dropships, boxy and ugly as the dreadnoughts that birthed them, were screaming down through the atmosphere. They trailed thick plumes of black exhaust, firing anti-personnel cannons into the surviving Hound formations as they descended. They weren't majestic. They didn't look like saviors. They looked like violence, incarnate a furious howling storm of metal and spite, tearing into the alien horde with an intimacy that bordered on the psychotic. Caleb stood in the ruins of his tomb, feeling the heat of the burning atmosphere wash over his face, and for the first time in 2 months, he let out a long, shuddering breath. The void had answered, and it was angry. The climb out of the crater was an agonizing, humiliating crawl. The tungsten rod had fused the surrounding dirt and bedrock into a smooth, glassy slope of obsidian slag. It was still radiating a blistering heat that baked the ambient air, making it waver and shimmer. Caleb's boots found zero purchase. He scrambled up on hands and knees, tearing his gloves on jagged microfractures in the glass, his breath wheezing through the broken filters of his helmet. Every time he slipped backward, the panic flared hot and sharp in his chest. He was irrationally terrified that the sky would close back up, that the dark would swallow them again. Below him, Davis was weeping. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical sob. It was a pathetic, continuous wet gasping. "I can't!" Davis choked out, his fingers sliding off the hot slag, sliding back down toward the darkness of the bunker. "My hands are burnt, Caleb. I can't grip it." Caleb stopped. He looked down at Davis, then up at the lip of the crater where the blinding white-hot sky beckoned. He wanted to leave him. The thought spiked through Caleb's exhausted brain with a brutal, terrifying clarity. "Just leave him. You survived. Don't die on the stairs." But Miller was already there. The medic grabbed Davis by the webbing of his tactical vest, his boots wedged into a cooling crack in the rock, and hauled him upward with a grunt that sounded like tearing muscle. "Move!" Miller grunted, his face pale and slick with sweat behind his visor. "Keep moving, Caleb. They aren't going to stop shooting just because we're in the way." Caleb turned back to the slope, digging his fingers into the blistering rock until his nails cracked. He pulled. He kicked. When he finally breached the lip of the crater, he rolled onto his back and threw an arm over his visor. The sunlight was a physical assault. He had spent 3 weeks in amber emergency lighting and total darkness. The raw, unfiltered glare of a yellow sun felt like someone was pouring bleach directly into his optic nerves. The noise was worse. Underground, the bombardment had been a muffled, rhythmic earthquake. Up here, it was an ocean of auditory violence. The air didn't just carry sound. It was compressed by it. The sonic booms of the dropships breaking the sound barrier merged into a continuous deafening roar. Anti-aircraft fire from the surviving Hound batteries painted the sky with jagged streaks of violent violet energy meeting the descending human vessels in mid-air. Caleb forced his eyes open, squinting through the tears, and dragged himself into a sitting position. The capital city of New Jericho was gone. He didn't mean it was heavily damaged. He meant the geography had been fundamentally erased. The skyline of sleek modular colonial hab blocks and the massive Trillium processing spires had been reduced to a flattened wasteland of pulverized concrete and twisted rebar. The human dreadnoughts hadn't bothered with precision targeting. They had simply applied overwhelming mathematical friction to the surface until the enemy's grid ceased to exist. A shadow fell over him, blocking the sun. Caleb flinched instinctively, raising his empty kinetic rifle. The heat radiating off the object above him was intense, smelling of burning aviation fuel, hot iron, and vaporized grease. It was a dropship. It hovered 30 feet off the ground, a blocky, aerodynamically offensive brick of dark gray armor plating. Its 4 massive VTOL thrusters scorched the earth below kicking up a hurricane of dust and ash that pelted Caleb's armor like a sandblaster. It didn't look like a vehicle of salvation. It looked like a flying tank that had been beaten into shape with hammers. With a hydraulic screech that vibrated in Caleb's molars, the side ramp deployed. It slammed into the dirt, crushing the charred remains of a hound crawler beneath a ton of reinforced steel. The figures that walked down the ramp weren't the shiny, polished heroes Caleb had seen in the fleet recruitment vids back on Earth. They were massive, heavily armored, and filthy. They wore deep void suits covered in thick, ablative plating. The armor was heavily scarred, coated in a fresh layer of black soot and alien viscera. There were no bright insignias, no gleaming visors. Their helmets were angular and brutal, featuring narrow reinforced slits for optics that glowed a dull, menacing crimson. The lead figure stepped off the ramp, his heavy magnetic boots crunching into the glassy soil. He didn't rush over to check on them. He didn't offer a hand. He just unslung a massive belt-fed rotary cannon from his shoulder, letting it hang casually from a harness. He looked down at Caleb. "You the bunker rats from Sector 4. The voice came through Caleb's local comms channel. It was deep grating and utterly devoid of emotion. Caleb just stared. He opened his mouth to speak, to say thank you, to say they were starving, to say almost everyone else was dead. What came out was a dry, ragged cough. He nodded. "Right," the soldier said. He keyed his shoulder comms. "Command, this is Hayes. Found 3 strays at the crater site. No hostiles in immediate perimeter. Proceeding with sweep." Hayes looked back down at Caleb. He reached to his utility belt, unclipping a battered metal canteen. He tossed it. It hit Caleb in the chest with a heavy thud. "Drink," Hayes said flatly. "Then get up. We aren't establishing a FOB here. You walk with us, or you sit here and wait for the scav teams to find your bodies." Miller hauled himself over the edge of the crater, dragging a violently shaking Davis behind him. Miller looked at Hayes, then at the massive dropship, then at the canteen in Caleb's lap. "Are you the evacuation force?" Miller rasped his voice, trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope. Hayes turned his back, racking the charging handle on his rotary cannon with a loud metallic clack. "Evac is for when you're giving up the rock," Hayes said, walking toward the smoldering ruins of the colony's commercial district. "We ain't giving up the rock. We're here to kill the roaches. Keep up." They walked for an hour, though time felt distorted, stretching and snapping like old rubber. Caleb's legs moved purely on muscle memory and the primal overriding fear of being left behind. The canteen water had tasted like iodine and tin, but it hit his dehydrated stomach like a jolt of pure adrenaline. It was enough to keep him upright. Hayes' squad consisted of 6 soldiers, including him. They moved in a loose, staggered formation through the ruins, their heavy boots crushing the pulverized concrete into a fine, choking powder. They didn't speak. They communicated entirely through subtle hand signals and the occasional curt burst of static over the encrypted local channel. Caleb walked in the center of the formation, flanked by Miller and Davis. He felt less like a rescued civilian and more like a prisoner of war being marched to a new camp. The sheer terrifying scale of the human counteroffensive was beginning to dawn on him. The sky above was a chaotic canopy of violence. Massive wedge-shaped atmospheric fighters screamed overhead in tight squadrons, trailing long plumes of condensation and fire. Every few minutes, the ground would heave violently as one of the dreadnoughts in low orbit unleashed another orbital strike on a hound concentration beyond the horizon. The sound would arrive seconds later, a deep chest-rattling boom that felt like a physical weight pressing against his lungs. "Jesus," Davis whispered, his voice hitching. He was staring at a pile of rubble to their left. Caleb followed his gaze. It was the colony's primary medical center, or at least it used to be. It was now a cratered shell of twisted steel girders and crushed plasteel. Beneath a massive slab of fallen concrete, a cluster of hound corpses lay pinned and crushed. But mixed in with the dark purplish blood of the aliens were the unmistakable brightly colored shreds of colonial civilian jumpsuits. The dreadnoughts hadn't bothered to check for survivors before leveling the grid. Caleb felt a sickening twist in his gut. A cold, hard knot of realization. The United Terran Fleet hadn't crossed 6 months of slip space to save 50,000 colonists. They had come to reclaim a strategic trillium mining asset. The people were just a depreciating statistic on a logistics ledger. He looked at the broad armored back of a soldier walking ahead of him. The soldier's shoulder pauldron had the name Cole stenciled on it in faded white paint. Cole was chewing something. Caleb could see the rhythmic flexing of his jaw muscles beneath the seal of his helmet. He was walking through a graveyard of Caleb's friends, and he was chewing gum. "Contact," Cole said suddenly. The word was flat bored almost. He didn't stop walking. He just fluidly raised a heavy snub-nosed shotgun from his hip and fired. The blast was deafening. It wasn't a clean kinetic round. It was a sprawling cloud of depleted uranium buckshot. The air ripped apart. A hound stalker, a slender multi-jointed variant designed for urban ambush, had been clinging to the underside of a collapsed overpass just 20 feet away. Its active camouflage was flickering, trying to blend with the gray concrete. Cole's shot took it in the center of mass while it was mid-leap. The impact suspended the creature in the air for a fraction of a second. Its hardened chitin, capable of deflecting standard colonial kinetic fire, simply shattered like cheap glass under the sheer kinetic energy of the uranium pellets. Pale gelatinous internal organs and a spray of caustic ammonia-smelling blood erupted outward. The stalker crashed into the dirt, missing Caleb by less than a yard. It was still alive. Its multiple legs thrashed wildly, its mandibles clicking in a frantic, high-pitched mechanical shriek of agony. Caleb scrambled backward, his heel catching on a piece of rebar, sending him hard into the dust. He raised his empty rifle out of sheer panic, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Cole walked over to the thrashing alien. He didn't slow his pace. He didn't look at Caleb. He just angled the barrel of his shotgun downward, placed it against the stalker's twitching primary optic cluster, and pulled the trigger again. The stalker's head vanished in a wet, heavy explosion. The thrashing stopped. "Clear," Cole muttered over the comms, racking the pump of the shotgun. The spent shell casing hit the ground with a dull clink, rolling to a stop against Caleb's boot. It was massive, thick brass radiating heat. The smell hit Caleb then. It wasn't the smell of a heroic victory. It was the suffocating stench of ammonia, burnt sugar, and evacuated bowels. He leaned over, clutching his stomach, and finally threw up the iodine water he had just drank right onto the crushed concrete. He hacked spitting stringy saliva, his vision swimming. A heavy gauntleted hand clamped onto the back of his tactical vest. It was Hayes. The sergeant yanked Caleb upward with effortless, terrifying strength, pulling him back to his feet. "Don't look at the meat," Hayes said. It wasn't advice. It was a command. "You look at the dirt in front of your boots, or you look at the back of Cole's helmet. You start looking at the meat, your brain starts thinking. You don't have the calories to think right now." Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his filthy glove. He looked into the red, glowing optic slits of Hayes's helmet. He couldn't see the man's eyes. He couldn't see anything human in there at all. Just a machine built for killing, wearing a meat suit of its own. "They were in the hospital," Caleb choked out, pointing a trembling finger toward the ruined medical center. "There were civilians in the sub-basements. Your ships. You brought the ceiling down on them." Hayes didn't look at the hospital. He didn't even turn his head. "Collateral," Hayes said, his voice grating over the comms. "The Hounds were using the structural density of the medical block to shield a subterranean breeding hive. The dreadnoughts dropped a bunker buster. Hive is dead. But the people are dead too." Hayes cut him off. "Just like you were dead an hour ago. The difference is the bugs are dying faster now." Hayes let go of Caleb's vest, giving him a slight shove forward. "Welcome back to the Terran Alliance, colonist. Keep moving." Caleb stumbled forward, falling back into line behind Cole. His hands were shaking. Not from fear anymore, but from a cold, hollow realization. The Hounds had come to exterminate them with mindless, animalistic efficiency. But the humans had brought an industrialized, calculated apocalypse. And they didn't care what they had to burn to win. Caleb kept his eyes on the dirt in front of his boots. The convoy pushed deeper into the ruins, the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps entirely swallowed by the howling of the human warships tearing the sky apart above them. They reached the staging ground just as the sun began to dip below the jagged, broken teeth of the city's ruined skyline. The military designated it FOB Goliath. To Caleb, it looked like a mechanized slaughterhouse built in the footprint of what used to be the colony's primary commercial spaceport. The Terrans hadn't built walls. They had dropped them from orbit. Massive rectangular ablative shielding blocks, each the size of a cargo container, and scarred from atmospheric entry, had been slammed into the tarmac to form a brutalist perimeter. Between the blocks, automated sentry turrets swiveled on heavy hydraulic mounts, their targeting lasers cutting through the thick settling dust like a cage of red wire. They tracked everything that moved, whining with a high-pitched predatory electric hum. Hayes didn't slow down as they approached the perimeter. The automated turrets snapped toward them, bathing Caleb in a lattice of red lasers. His breath caught in his throat. He waited for the deafening roar of uranium rounds to tear him in half. The turrets chimed a dull, synthetic confirmation and swiveled away, returning to their arcs. IFF tags. The Marines were transmitting friend or foe signals. Caleb realized with a cold sweat that if he had stumbled upon this base alone, the machines wouldn't have hesitated to turn him into pink mist. "Inside," Hayes grunted, pointing a thick armored finger toward a gap between two shield blocks. "Follow the yellow glow tape on the deck. Do not step off the tape. The inner minefield is armed." Caleb grabbed Davis by the elbow and practically dragged him over the threshold. Miller followed his eyes, darting wildly across the interior of the base. It was a hive of violent industry. Hundreds of Marines in various states of repair moved with terrifying silent efficiency. There was no yelling. There was no frantic running. There was only the low, continuous murmur of encrypted comms and the heavy thud-thud-thud of magnetic boots on the cracked tarmac. To the left, a row of heavy dropships were hot refueling. Thick black hoses pulsed with liquid promethium, the fumes so dense they made the air wobble. Sparks rained down from welding torches as mechanized servo arms fused patch plates over gaping acid burns on the dropship's hulls. To the right was the casualty collection point. Miller instinctively drifted toward it, his medic training kicking in. Caleb reached out to stop him, but his hand slipped off Miller's shoulder. There were no beds, just rows of armored figures lying on the hard concrete. Medics in stripped-down void suits walked among them, carrying heavy pneumatic medical staplers and canisters of bioluminescent green foam. Nobody was screaming. That was the most unnerving part. A Marine with his leg sheared off above the knee sat propped against a supply crate, calmly eating a protein paste out of a foil tube, while a medic clamped a tourniquet and flooded the stump with biofoam. Miller stopped at the edge of the collection point, his hands trembling. He watched a medic casually snap a dislocated shoulder back into place with a sickening crunch. The patient barely grunted, just nodded, and stood up to reload his magazines. "Step back, colonist," a heavily modified medical officer barked at Miller. The officer's left eye was entirely cybernetic, a whirring lens of cold blue light. "You're contaminating the sterile field." I can help," Miller stammered, holding up his filthy hands. "I was the acting medical proxy for Sector 4. The officer looked at Miller. He didn't look angry. He just looked incredibly tired. "You don't have the tools to fix what bites us, Doc. Sit down. Stay out of the way." Caleb pulled Miller back. "Let it go, man. Just let it go." They were directed into a holding pen constructed from temporary kinetic fencing, a humming wall of hard light energy that smelled like an impending thunderstorm. There were about 50 other survivors huddled inside. 50 out of a colony of 50,000. Caleb slumped against the cold concrete of the tarmac and pulled his knees to his chest. His body felt like it was made of lead and bruised meat. A logistics drone hovered over the pen, dropping a cardboard box with a heavy thud. It contained rectangular foil-wrapped bricks, rations. Davis scrambled forward, his hands shaking so violently he tore the foil with his teeth. He bit into the brick. It was gray, dense, and tasteless, synthetic caloric paste. Davis chewed, choked, and swallowed, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. "They don't care," Davis whispered, his mouth full of gray paste. He looked at Caleb, his eyes wide and fractured. "Did you see them? They aren't here for us, Caleb. We're just in the way." "Eat your food, Davis," Caleb said quietly. He didn't have the energy to lie. "We're going to die here," Davis said, his voice rising, breaking into a hysterical, raspy whine. He pointed a trembling finger at the hard light fence. "They put us in a cage. The bugs are going to overrun this place, and we're locked in a cage." "Shut up," Caleb hissed, glancing nervously at a pair of heavily armed Marines patrolling the perimeter of the pen. "I won't shut up," Davis screamed, scrambling to his feet. He threw the ration brick at the energy fence. It vaporized with a sharp crack. "Hey, let us out. You can't keep us here. You're supposed to evacuate us." One of the Marines stopped. He turned slowly the servos in his armor, whining. He walked over to the edge of the pen and looked down at Davis. The Marine's helmet visor was opaque black. He was a faceless monolith of violence. "Sit down," the Marine said. The external speaker on his suit distorted the voice into a deep, mechanical growl. "No," Davis shrieked, taking a step forward. "My wife was in Sector 2. My kids were in Sector 2. You leveled it. You dropped a bomb on them." The Marine didn't flinch. He didn't offer condolences. He reached to his hip and unclasped a heavy, blunt kinetic baton. "Hysterics drain oxygen and morale. Sit down, or I will put you to sleep," the Marine stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple recitation of procedure. Caleb lunged forward, grabbing Davis by the tactical vest and violently dragging him backward. He threw all his weight into it, slamming Davis onto the tarmac and pinning him there. "He's sitting!" Caleb yelled at the Marine, his voice cracking. "He's sitting! Leave him alone!" The Marine stared at them for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he clipped the baton back to his belt and resumed his patrol. Caleb let go of Davis, rolling onto his back, staring up at the darkening sky. The artillery fire hadn't stopped. It was a continuous rolling thunder in the distance. They weren't survivors. They were just debris swept into a corner while the gods fought. The attack didn't come from the sky. It came from beneath the concrete. Caleb was drifting into a state of exhausted, restless micro-sleep when the tarmac beneath him groaned. It wasn't the rhythmic shaking of orbital bombardment. It was a sickening, hollow buckling. A klaxon siren tore through the base, a jagged, ear-piercing shriek that made the blood in Caleb's veins run cold. The hard light fencing surrounding the civilian pen instantly snapped off, plunging them into the ambient gloom of the floodlights. Seismic breach, inner perimeter, all units free fire. The automated warning system boomed over the base loudspeakers, devoid of any panic. 30 yards away, right in the center of the refueling depot, the 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete of the spaceport tarmac bulged upward, fracturing into a spider web of jagged cracks. Then it exploded outward. A geyser of dirt, shattered concrete, and pulverized piping shot 50 feet into the air. From the crater, a nightmare erupted. It wasn't the standard Hound infantry they had fought in the tunnels. This was a breacher. The creature was the size of a municipal dump truck. Its carapace was heavily armored in thick, overlapping plates of matte black chitin that absorbed the floodlights rather than reflecting them. It had no eyes, just a massive, blunt, wedge-shaped head designed to pulverize bedrock. Its front limbs were heavily muscled, ending in spinning, serrated biological drills that sprayed acid and crushed stone. Before the dust even settled, the breacher lunged. It slammed its massive wedge head into the side of a fueling dropship. The heavy armor of the Terran vessel crumpled like aluminum foil. Sparks showered over the ruptured promethium hoses. "Get down!" Caleb screamed, shoving Davis and Miller flat against the tarmac. The ensuing explosion turned the night into noon. A massive fireball of hypercombustible aviation fuel rolled across the base, sending a shockwave that lifted Caleb off the ground and slammed him back down hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. When he opened his eyes, his ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the battle. The breacher was on fire, but it wasn't dying. It thrashed wildly, its massive limbs crushing supply crates and swatting a heavily armored Marine through the air like a rag doll. Behind the colossal beast, the horde poured out of the tunnel. Hundreds of stalkers and heavy infantry hounds flooded the tarmac, a surging tide of clicking mandibles and red eyes. The Terran response was instantaneous and utterly merciless. The automated turrets spun toward the breach, their rotary barrels spinning into a blur. A continuous deafening roar of depleted uranium rounds chewed into the swarm. The air filled with the sickening scent of vaporized chitin and boiling alien blood. The tracer rounds created a strobe light effect, illuminating the slaughter in chaotic strobe light flashes. Marines didn't retreat to cover. They advanced. A squad formed a phalanx 20 feet from the crater edge. They knelt, planted heavy suppression shields into the concrete, and opened up with heavy machine guns. It was a wall of lead. The hounds charged at their bodies, literally disintegrating as they hit the kinetic stream. But there were too many. They began to climb over the pulverized remains of their own dead to close the gap. "We have to move," Miller yelled, grabbing Caleb's shoulder. "We're completely exposed." Caleb looked around. The civilian holding area was right in the path of a secondary swarm breaking off from the main crater. Dozens of smaller, agile hounds were scrambling over the debris, their mandibles snapping, heading straight for the cluster of terrified colonists. "To the drop pods!" Caleb pointed toward the massive ablative shielding blocks at the perimeter. "There's cover between them." He scrambled to his feet, pulling a paralyzed Davis up by his webbing. They ran. A hound leapt over a burning supply crate, cutting them off. It was a heavy infantry cast, its thick armor scorched and smoking. It let out a mechanical grinding hiss, its jaws opening to reveal rows of jagged razor-sharp teeth, dripping with a caustic clear venom. Caleb instinctively reached for his kinetic rifle. His hands grasped empty air. He had dropped it when Hayes pulled him out of the dust hours ago. He was completely unarmed. The hound coiled its powerful hind legs, preparing to lunge. A deafening crack ripped past Caleb's right ear. He felt the heat of the projectile singe the fine hairs on his neck. The hound's head snapped backward, an entry wound the size of a fist, punching perfectly through its heavy facial plating. The creature collapsed in a twitching, oozing heap, its momentum carrying it forward until it slid to a halt at Caleb's boots. Caleb looked back. A Marine was lying on the tarmac 10 feet away. His legs were gone, crushed beneath a piece of shrapnel from the exploding dropship. He had dragged himself out of the blast radius, his biosuit desperately trying to clamp down the catastrophic bleeding. He was holding a massive heavy-caliber sidearm, a hand cannon designed to punch through engine blocks. The Marine's helmet was gone. For the first time, Caleb saw a human face beneath the armor. It was a woman. She looked shockingly young, her face smeared with soot and pale from blood loss. She wasn't looking at Caleb. She was staring at the swarm. She racked the slide of the heavy pistol with a trembling, blood-slicked hand. She raised it to fire again, but her arm gave out. The gun clattered onto the tarmac, sliding a few feet toward Caleb. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. Caleb didn't think. The primal feral instinct that had kept him alive in the dark for 3 weeks took over. He dropped Davis, scrambled forward on his hands and knees, and grabbed the grip of the discarded weapon. It was impossibly heavy, designed for the hydraulically assisted grip of a Marine's gauntlet, not the exhausted, trembling hands of a maintenance technician. Another hound rounded the burning crate, its red eyes locking onto Caleb. Caleb raised the pistol. He didn't have the strength to hold it steady with one hand. He cupped his left hand under the grip, planted his feet into the cracked tarmac, and squeezed the heavy trigger. The recoil was a physical assault. The gun bucked violently, throwing Caleb's arms backward with a force that sent a sickening pop through his right wrist. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded him a massive blossom of kinetic fire. When his vision cleared a second later, the hound was gone. The depleted uranium slug had hit it dead center, tearing the creature in half with such overwhelming force that its upper torso had been thrown 10 feet backward into the flames. Caleb stood there, his chest heaving, his right wrist throbbing with a sharp, blinding agony. He looked at the heavy pistol in his hand. The barrel was smoking. He didn't feel heroic. He felt a terrifying electric surge of violent adrenaline. He looked up at the endless swarm pouring out of the crater, then down at the gun. "Miller," Caleb gasped, his voice barely a rasp. "Get Davis to the perimeter blocks. Don't look back." "What are you doing?" Miller yelled, ducking, as a stray plasma bolt seared overhead. Caleb gritted his teeth, shifting the agonizing weight of the pistol fully into his unsprained left hand. He thumbed the heavy safety catch, feeling the satisfying mechanical click reverberate through the grip. "I'm clearing a path," Caleb said. He didn't wait for them. He stepped over the dead Marine, raised the heavy pistol, and walked directly toward the roaring, clicking nightmare of the swarm, the gun heavy and hot in his shaking hands. The heavy pistol felt less like a weapon and more like an anvil in Caleb's left hand. It was balanced for a powered gauntlet, the grip too thick for his fingers, the metal casing hot enough to blister his palm. He didn't run. Running required a physical coordination he no longer possessed. He limped forward, his sprained right arm tucked tight against his chest, his boots slipping on the slick, ammonia-scented gore that coated the tarmac. A hound cleared the burning wreckage of the dropship. It was a worker caste smaller than the infantry, but fast. Its mandibles clattered in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. It saw Caleb. It didn't hesitate. It vaulted off a crushed supply crate, launching itself through the smoke. Caleb didn't aim. He just leveled the barrel and squeezed the trigger. The gun barked a concussive roar that shoved his shoulder backward. He missed. The depleted uranium slug tore through the air a foot to the creature's left, slamming into the concrete tarmac behind it. The impact pulverized the rock, sending a spray of razor-sharp concrete shrapnel outward. The hound shrieked as the rock fragment shredded its right flank, its trajectory breaking. It crashed onto the tarmac, skidding violently toward Caleb's boots, its front legs thrashing. Caleb stepped over it, aimed down, and fired again. The recoil wrenched his left wrist backward, sending a sharp spike of pain up to his elbow. The round took the alien through the center of its carapace. The kinetic force didn't just kill it. It caved the creature inward, leaving a gaping, smoking crater in its thorax. He didn't have time to process the kill. The smoke parted, and 3 more hounds were scrambling over the debris, their red eyes locking onto him. Panic raw and electric spiked in his chest. Caleb fired again. The heavy slide slammed back, ejecting a massive brass casing that bounced off his chest armor. The shot went wide, shattering the floodlight on a perimeter barrier. He fired a 4th time. The recoil twisted the gun in his hand, the muzzle flipping dangerously upward. Click. The slide locked back. Empty. He stood there 15 feet from the surging swarm, holding a heavy smoking piece of useless metal. The adrenaline that had propelled him forward instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. He had bought Davis and Miller maybe 4 seconds. It felt entirely insignificant. The lead hound lunged its jaws, snapping open to reveal rows of translucent, venom-slicked teeth. Caleb closed his eyes. He didn't brace. He just waited for the tearing of teeth and the wet heat of his own blood. A massive armored hand clamped onto his tactical vest from behind. Caleb was jerked backward so violently his boots left the ground. He flew backward, landing hard on his spine, the wind leaving his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. Hayes stepped over him. The sergeant didn't have his rotary cannon anymore. He held a heavy hydraulic breaching axe. The weapon hummed with a low, violent frequency, the monomolecular edge glowing a dull, angry orange. Hayes swung. It wasn't an elegant strike. It was a brutal industrial chop. The glowing blade met the leaping hound in midair. It didn't cut the creature. It cleaved it, cauterizing the wound instantly as it passed through chitin meat and bone. The 2 halves of the alien hit the tarmac with a wet, heavy slap. "Stay on the ground, meat!" Hayes roared, his voice distorted into a demonic rasp by his helmet speakers. Hayes didn't step back. He waded into the swarm, the heavy axe rising and falling in rhythmic, mechanized arcs of absolute butchery. The ground beneath Caleb heaved again. The breacher, the colossal dump truck-sized nightmare that had started the attack, had finally managed to right itself amidst the burning promethium. It let out a deafening subsonic bellow that rattled the teeth in Caleb's skull, turning its massive wedge-shaped head toward the center of the FOB. Then the sky turned violet. Danger close. All units brace for orbital lance. The automated warning system barely finished the sentence before the void answered. A beam of concentrated plasma 3 feet wide and burning hotter than the surface of a star punched down from the low-orbit dreadnoughts directly through the atmosphere. It struck the breacher dead center. There was no explosion. There was only a blinding flash of violet light and the instantaneous displacement of air. The heat wave hit Caleb a fraction of a second later, a blistering wall of thermal energy that instantly singed his eyebrows and baked his cracked lips. When the spots cleared from his vision, the breacher was gone. In its place was a perfectly circular, glowing crater of molten slag 30 feet deep. The beam had completely vaporized the creature and the bedrock beneath it. The remaining hounds stopped, their hive mind connection severed or panicked by the overwhelming display of kinetic superiority. They turned and began to scramble back down the tunnels, abandoning the assault. The heavy machine guns of the Marine phalanx didn't stop firing. They chewed the retreating aliens into a fine bloody paste until the automated turrets spun down their barrels, glowing cherry red. Silence descended on the FOB, broken only by the crackle of burning fuel and the harsh, ragged breathing of the survivors. Hayes walked back toward Caleb. His armor was coated in a thick, steaming layer of caustic blood and ash. The sergeant looked down at the empty hand cannon lying next to Caleb, then down at Caleb's swollen, shaking wrists. "You missed twice," Hayes said flatly. He didn't offer a hand. He just turned and walked toward the burning dropship. Caleb lay on the cracked tarmac, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He had tried to be the hero. He had tried to draw a line in the sand, and the Terran war machine had simply stepped over him, entirely indifferent to his courage. Miller appeared in his peripheral vision, his face pale and streaked with soot. He grabbed Caleb by the armpits and hauled him upright, groaning under the weight. "You're an idiot," Miller breathed, his voice shaking. "You're a massive, stupid idiot." "I know," Caleb whispered, his throat raw. "I know. The evacuation wasn't a rescue. It was a tactical withdrawal." The local comms channel buzzed to life with the cold, synthesized voice of Fleet Command. "FOB Goliath is compromised. Subterranean hive integrity is higher than estimated. Evacuate all personnel. Initiating planetary crust fracture protocols in T-40 minutes. They were giving up on the surface. They were going to crack the planet open to burn out the infection." The Marines moved with the same silent, terrifying efficiency as before. There was no scrambling, no panic. They simply packed their gear, loaded their wounded, and boarded the surviving dropships. Caleb, Miller, and Davis were shoved toward the loading ramp of a heavy transport. The interior was Spartan, a cavernous steel belly smelling of hydraulic fluid, biofoam, and the metallic tang of dried blood. There were no seats. They were told to sit on the grated floor and hold on to the cargo netting. Davis sat in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest. He was rocking slowly, staring at nothing. His mind had finally fractured, retreating deep inward to hide from the sensory overload of the past 12 hours. Miller sat next to him, gently wrapping Caleb's sprained wrist in a rigid splint fashioned from discarded ration packaging and medical tape. "Hold still," Miller grunted, pulling the tape tight. Caleb winced, his breath hissing through his teeth. "You think they'll take us back to Earth?" Miller didn't look up. "Earth is full, Caleb. They'll drop us at a refugee processing station on Titan or Mars. Give us a tin cup and a cot. We're a liability now. The colony is gone." The massive ramp closed with a heavy hydraulic shutter, sealing them inside the dim red-lit belly of the ship. The engines roared a deep bone-rattling vibration that shook the deck plating. Gravity pressed heavily against Caleb's chest as the transport lifted off, fighting the atmospheric drag to claw its way back into orbit. Caleb leaned his head against the cold steel of the bulkhead. Beside him was a narrow, reinforced viewport. He looked out. Through the thick, scratched plasteel, he watched the surface of New Jericho fall away. The once thriving colony, the place he had spent 3 years fixing atmospheric scrubbers and drinking cheap synthetic beer, was nothing but a blackened, cratered wasteland. As the dropship broke through the upper atmosphere, the true scale of the Terran fleet revealed itself. Dozens of massive scarred dreadnoughts hung in the void, their engines burning with cold blue fire. They were shifting formation, aligning their colossal macro cannons toward the planet's surface. They weren't aiming at cities anymore. They were aiming at the tectonic fault lines. The human response to the alien invasion wasn't to fight a ground war. It was to perform a localized extermination. They were going to shatter the crust, flood the subterranean hives with magma, and then wait for the rock to cool so they could send the mining rigs back down. A heavily armored Marine walked past them, securing a row of kinetic rifles to a bulkhead rack. It was Cole. The soldier paused, looking down at Caleb and the makeshift splint on his wrist. Cole reached into a pouch on his tactical webbing and pulled out a small foil-wrapped brick. He tossed it onto Caleb's lap. "Chocolate," Cole said, his voice entirely deadpan. "Stole it from an officer's stash. You look like you need the blood sugar mechanic." Caleb stared at the foil package. It was dented and warm. He looked up at Cole, trying to find some trace of humanity, some flicker of empathy behind the scarred, brutalist visor of the helmet. There was nothing, just cold red optic slits. "Why did you come?" Caleb asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "If you were just going to destroy the planet, why send the ground troops? Why pull us out?" Cole finished latching the rifles. He didn't look back at Caleb. "Command didn't send us for you," Cole said softly. "They sent us to secure the primary Trillium refineries. When the bugs overran them, Command decided the asset was a total loss. You being at that crater was just a statistical anomaly. We don't leave Terran DNA behind for the bugs to study. That's it." Cole walked away, disappearing into the forward compartment. Caleb looked back out the viewport. The dreadnoughts opened fire. Massive, brilliant streaks of kinetic energy slammed into the planet below. The crust began to spiderweb glowing lines of orange magma bleeding through the ash-choked atmosphere. He unpeeled the foil wrapper with his good hand. He took a bite of the chocolate. It was stale, chalky, and slightly metallic. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He sat in the dark, vibrating belly of the war machine, holding his broken wrist and listening to Davis rock back and forth. They were alive, not because they were brave, and not because they were saved by heroes. They were alive because they were a minor logistical detail in a war too massive for them to comprehend. The void outside the viewport was black and silent, but Caleb knew the truth now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with monsters. And the scariest ones were the ones wearing human faces. The universe isn't a grand stage for heroes. It's a meat grinder where survival usually comes down to stubbornness and blind luck. Caleb learned the hard way that humanity's response to the dark isn't a warm embrace. It's a loaded gun and a willingness to burn the house down to kill the spiders. If you felt the heat of the dropships and the brutal reality of the Terran Alliance, smash that like button. Drop a comment below. Would you rather face the hounds in the dark or the fleet in the light? Make sure to subscribe for more gritty sci-fi.